As you remember from the previous slide or two, one of the difficulties that organisations face in managing fatigue-related risk is the decision on whether to further refine a specific or individual control versus the opportunity to introduce additional controls to the system. You will often find in organisations that the instinctual response is towards perfecting an individual control rather than introducing additional controls. And it doesn't matter whether you have a simple approach, such as the roster and compliance with the enterprise bargaining agreement as the primary control, or like some organisations where you move to fatigue modelling tools, either the simple paper and pencil tools we showed you earlier, or the more sophisticated approaches based on fatigue modelling software and biomathematical models. The point, however, is the instinctual response of those organisations is to focus on endlessly refining a single control. The difficulty with that, even if it is a high technology approach, is that the cost becomes prohibitive, as we showed in those previous slides. In a sense, level 1 controls had the capacity to ensure that people gave you an adequate sleep opportunity. The purpose of a level 2 control is to identify a specific individual who might be impaired on a specific occasion. If we were to do that with a level 1 control, we would have to set the levels so low in order to ensure that nobody was ever unfit for duty. And this would either reduce people's capacity to work and earn overtime, or conversely, it may reduce the operational flexibility of the organisation. Given that only a relatively small number of individuals are likely to be impaired, it may only be 1 or 2% of the population, then in our opinion it is much better to introduce a secondary control or an additional level of control that works from a slightly different perspective. In this section we'd like to introduce you to the idea of level 2 controls. Level 2 controls are based around ensuring that the employee discharges their duty of care responsibility, that is to ensure that while provided with an adequate opportunity to rest and recover, they've actually used that in order to gain sufficient sleep, or in the event that they have not had sufficient sleep, that they are able to identify that fact and report it to the organisation so that the appropriate risk management, assessment and control can be undertaken. The primary purpose of a level 2 control is to identify an individual on a specific occasion who may not be fit for duty despite having been provided an adequate opportunity to rest and recover. There are two elements to a level 2 control. The first is that we need to have a legally and scientifically defensible principle on which to base the risk assessment. And second, we must be able to implement credible hazard controls in order to manage the event. In many organisations, the initial response to somebody being unfit for work is to suggest that it is inappropriate for them to work and therefore they will not work on that particular occasion. We think that that is not necessarily the appropriate strategy. From a fatigue risk management perspective, you would want to know what increase in risk there was and what tasks may or may not be appropriate for that individual to undertake. For many organisations, it can be merely a question of allocating somebody to a secondary task, that is a task which is less susceptible or has a lower risk associated with fatigue-related error. In many organisations, the threat of somebody not being able to work makes the likelihood of reporting fatigue extremely low. On the other hand, in organisations where fatigue is part of the normal mainstream safety assessment and management, it is extremely reasonable to expect people to indicate, yes, I am fatigued for the following reasons, here's the risk, and here's how we're going to manage it today. One of the important issues that we'd like you to think about in this course is that shift in the organisation away from the notion of fatigue means you can't work to one in which an elevated level of risk associated with fatigue requires an additional set of controls to be put in place. In some cases, and I have to admit it's relatively rarely, it may be the case that the only appropriate control is to cease work or to cease undertaking tasks that are at risk. But in our experience, there's a lot that can be done to manage the risk of fatigue without necessarily stopping that individual from working. Level 2 risk assessment is based on an incredibly simple but important idea. That is, rather than asking people to assess fatigue as an internal, unverifiable psychological state, ask them how much sleep they've had. What we know from the scientific research literature is that the amount of sleep that you've had and how long you've been awake are the primary determinants of how fatigued you are likely to be. The beauty about asking this on an individual level for a specific occasion is that based on the research we can make a reasonably accurate assessment of the likely level of risk associated with an individual's level of fatigue by simply analysing how much sleep they've had and how long they've been awake. Now, some of what we go through in the next section may seem a little bit complicated, but it's important for you to concentrate on this and to work through the examples that we will talk about. So, if you look on the slide, you will see a graphic that represents a work shift and then the two preceding sleep periods prior to that work shift. As with most risk assessment, the start of the work shift is the point at which we would like to start that risk assessment process. So, on the basis of what you see on that graph, think about yourself in the following situation. You've come to work, and then in order to undertake the risk assessment, that is whether you are or are not fit for duty, we need to answer a couple of questions. The first question, and you'll see on the graph that this is what we refer to as X, is a measure of the amount of sleep that you had in the 24 hours prior to starting work. So for example, if you start work at 8 o'clock in the morning, then you would count back to 8 o'clock the previous morning and then total up all the sleep that you had had in that 24-hour period. In some cases, particularly in shift workers, that may be split into two separate sleep periods. For example, you may have had 4 hours at one point in time, woken up and then had a nap before you went to work again. In that situation, for example, a combination of 4 hours sleep and 2 hours sleep would total to a 6-hour sleep duration in that 24 hours. So count up all of the sleep periods that you've had and give that value X, which is the amount of sleep in the 24 hours prior to work. For some individuals, time in bed and amount of sleep are not the same thing. So for example, if you went to bed at 11 o'clock at night and woke up at 6 but spent an hour reading or watching TV, take an hour off that time in bed so that you've actually recorded the amount of sleep that you've had. You don't need to be too precise about this. If you can count your sleep to the nearest 15 minutes, that probably provides sufficient accuracy in order to do a reasonable risk assessment of fitness for duty. The second number that you need to consider is the amount of sleep that you've had in the 48 hours prior to starting work. So for example, if we in the first section of this calculation identified that you had had 6 hours in the 24 hours prior to starting work, count back from 8 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock the morning before, and now count back another 24 hours and total the amount of sleep that you had in the entire 48-hour period. So if you had 6 hours in the sleep before starting work and 8 the day before, that would mean a total of 6 plus 8 is 14. If you had had 5 hours in the 24 hours prior to starting work and 7 in the 24 hours prior to that, then that would equal 5 plus 7 equals 12 hours sleep in the prior 48 hours. The reason that we look at sleep both in the prior 24 and 48 hours is to ensure that we get a long-term average of the amount of sleep. You may have had a very short sleep on one night but a very long sleep the night before, or conversely you might have had a short sleep one night and a long sleep the night after that. What we know from the research is the amount of sleep that you have had in the 48 hours prior to starting work is a good measure of the likely level of fatigue that you will experience. It's also the case that people say, well, what about sleep more than 48 hours ago? Well, that's a pragmatic decision. What we know is that most of the variability can be accounted for by sleep in the prior 24 and 48 hours. That does not mean that sleep before that doesn't have an influence, but most importantly that the influence is not particularly important. What we're trying to do here is to find a balance between the simplicity of the calculation and the complexity of the calculation. What our experience tells us is that people are usually quite good at remembering the amount of sleep they've had in the prior 24 and 48 hours. But once we go to a period further in the past than that, people struggle to actually be able to remember how much sleep they had 3 days ago. So, the important points to understand here are the amount of sleep you had in the prior 24 hours, which we call X, the amount of sleep that you had in the prior 48 hours, which we call Y, and then lastly, as you can see from graphic, we also need to know how long you've been awake. This is an important additional factor. That is, in many cases, people start work well after they have woken up. In practice, the fatigue clock starts counting from the moment that you wake up, not from the moment you start work. That's why, for example, people who are working night shift may get up at 7 or 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, but not start work until 11 or 12 o'clock at night, in which case they've been awake for 14 or 15 hours at the time they start work, and by the time they finish work, they may have been awake for nearly 24 hours. It's important to ensure that we take into account how long you've been awake as well as how much sleep you've had in the prior 24 and 48 hours. So, if you are able to write down X, the amount of sleep you had in the prior 24 hours, Y, the amount of sleep you had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, and Z, the amount of time that you have been awake since a sleep of at least 2 hours duration, those three numbers together will enable you to do a very simple but reliable calculation to assess the likelihood of fatigue at the personal level. It's kind of obvious when you think about it, but the less sleep you've had and the longer you've been awake, the more likely you are to be fatigued. The question is, however, how much sleep do you actually need? And this is a complicated question, and the answer to this is not simple and straightforward. And there is much disagreement amongst researchers and scientists about what is the actual amount of sleep you need. Part of that argument and part of the disagreement focuses around what it is that you want to measure. That is, how much sleep do you need in order to do what? How much sleep do you need in order to be bright-eyed and bushy-tailed? How much sleep do you need in order to be safe? The readings that we have given you will provide you some background reading in the area and will enable you to think about what it is that you need to do in determining how much sleep you need. But for the purposes of this course and for the purposes of the risk assessment techniques that we're teaching you here, what we have done is based the threshold values for sleep around a couple of very simple values that are easy to remember and have at least a strong scientific defensibility to support them. So, if you look at the first value, X, how much sleep have you had in the 24 hours prior to starting work? We would typically suggest that where an individual has had less than 5 hours of sleep in the prior 24 hours, then that they are likely to be at an elevated risk of fatigue or at an elevated likelihood of making a fatigue-related error. If we look at the amount of sleep that you've had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, the research suggests that where you have had less than 12 hours sleep in the prior 48 hours to commencing work, then you are likely again to be at an elevated risk of fatigue. And finally, and this one's a little bit more complicated, if we look at the Z score, if you have been awake for more than the amount of sleep that you have had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, you will also be at an elevated risk of fatigue. Now, this last one's a little bit complicated, and let me try and explain why we think about it in that way. As a threshold value, once you have been awake for longer than the amount of sleep that you had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, the greater the likelihood that you will be fatigued. If you'd like to think about this in simple terms, we suggest that sleep buys you wakefulness. That is, the more sleep that you've had, the longer you're able to sustain alert wakefulness, or conversely, the less sleep you've had, the shorter the duration of time that you can sustain alertness for. In very simple terms, if you have had a good sleep for 8 hours for the last 2 nights, then you can probably sustain wakefulness at a reasonably alert level for 16 hours. But if you've only had 12 hours sleep in the last 2 days, then you probably aren't able to sustain a high level of waking alertness for anywhere near as long. So if you think about it in simple terms, the amount of sleep that you've had determines the amount of time that you can maintain wakefulness for. And as a rough rule of thumb, we would suggest to you that for every hour of sleep in the 48 hours prior to starting work, you buy yourself an hour of wakefulness in the current wake period. Now, there will be a lot of arguments about this. Is it exactly 1 hour? Is it 1.5 hours? And we have provided you some literature that will enable you to understand that discussion. But for the purposes of the course, that value, that is, for every hour of sleep in the prior 48 hours, you buy yourself 1 hour of wakefulness, seems to be a reasonable rule of thumb. Now, where do we get that rule of thumb from? It's quite simple. If you think about it from a normal human perspective, most people will get 8 hours of sleep and 16 hours of wakefulness in any 24-hour period. If we count back 2 days and say you had 2 8-hour periods of sleep, then 8 and 8 equals 16, and that buys you the 16 hours of wakefulness. Now the question is, why do we use the 2-night average rather than the 1-night average? And again, the reason for that is quite simple. The amount of sleep that you've had in the prior 48 hours to starting work is a more stable measure of sleep loss and a better predictor of the likely level of fatigue that you will experience. But again, what we're trying to do with this algorithm or this set of rules is to give you some very simple principles on determining whether you're fit for work. So, to summarise, if you have had less than 5 hours sleep in the 24 hours prior to starting work, if you have had less than 12 hours sleep in the prior 48 hours to starting work, or you have been awake for longer than the amount of sleep you had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, then you will be at an elevated level of risk of fatigue. Now, how organisations use this particular threshold approach will vary based on a number of factors which we'll talk about in some detail later. In some organisations, they like to keep it really simple. They may say, for example, in the event that you've had less than 5 in the prior 24 or less than 12 in the prior 48, or you've been awake for longer than the amount of sleep you had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, let your line manager know, and then there will be a discussion around how we will manage the risk. In some organisations, they keep it even simpler. We know a number of trucking companies who simply require people to state at the start of every shift that they have had at least 6 hours sleep in the 24 hours prior to starting work. Some organisations do this in very simple ways, which is what we would refer to an exception reporting model. If you haven't had the required amount of sleep, then you have an obligation to communicate that to somebody. In other organisations, it may be explicitly stated at the start of the shift. So for example, as I said, in the trucking companies, some people are required to sign off that they are fit for work at the start of every drive. In some mining companies, we may find that there is a toolbox meeting at the start of the shift, and the supervisor may ask individuals whether they are fit for work or if anybody is not fit for work. In some organisations, they may be asked and be required to write it down. What's the right combination for your organisation will depend a lot on where your organisation is on that safety culture trajectory. For organisations which have a high level of safety culture and a just culture framework, then reporting, writing it down, documenting it, and using it as the basis of risk calculations and control mechanisms can be relatively simple and straightforward. On the other hand, in some organisations where the trust levels are not so high and the level of sophistication or maturity in the organisation is poor, you might find that the model needs to be implemented in a very simple way to start with. Part of the challenge in a course like this is to look at the tools that we provide you with and then to try and work out what way I can best implement this control within my organisation, and what is the level of development that my organisation can tolerate over the next 12, 24 or 36 months. In many organisations, as a general rule, start simple, develop trust, and as the organisation matures, so can the sophistication of the policy that you'll use. The biggest mistake that you can make is to try to implement a policy that's too sophisticated for your organisation and you're not able to follow up with the appropriate policy, practice and recommendations that we talk about. So start off, keep it simple, and if in doubt, develop over time. We can generally teach people to calculate their fatigue likelihood score with a few examples within a 10 to 15 minute period. What I'm going to go through now is 3 worked examples to give you some understanding of how we would use this in a practical sense in a workplace. If you look on example 1, you'll see that they are work periods in the green square, and immediately preceding that are 2 sleep periods of 4 and 7 hours respectively. When we use these kinds of tools, we typically use them to calculate the fatigue score at the start of the shift in order to work out whether somebody is good to go. And then we also want to know for how long are they good to go, and that is, will they be able to work through to the end of the shift. So you will see here that we have calculations undertaken for the start and the end of the shift period. If we look at the first example on the graphic in the top of the screen, you'll see that we have an individual here working a 12-hour shift, starting at 8 o'clock in the morning and working through till 8 o'clock in the evening. They slept for 4 hours between 0200 and 0600 that morning preceding it, and then prior to that they slept between 11 o'clock and 6 o'clock in the morning. That is a 7-hour sleep period. This corresponds to a traditional 12-hour shift system, and you'll see in the column labelled start we have rows corresponding to the X, Y and Z values for this particular shift. Again, the focus of the analysis is to look at calculating at the start of the shift, am I good to go? That is, what is my fatigue score at the start of the shift, and what will be my fatigue score at the end of the shift. Now, if you look at the X row, you will see that the individual has had 4 hours sleep in the prior 24. That is 1 hour less than the threshold value of 5, and for that 1 hour less than the threshold value of 5, you pick up 4 points. So you'll see at the start of the shift that individual has picked up +4 risk points because they've had only 4 hours in the prior 24. If you go to the next row, we're summing up the amount of sleep that they had in the 48 hours prior to starting work. So if we count back from 8 o'clock in the morning and count back 2 days, you will see that that individual has had a total of 11 hours of sleep in the 48 hours prior to starting work. Again, that 11 hours of sleep in the prior 48 is 1 hour below the 12-hour threshold. So therefore, because there are 2 points for each hour below that threshold, that individual will pick up +2 points. If we now look at the Z row, you'll see that that individual has had 11 hours of sleep in the 48 hours prior to starting work. What that means is that individual's 11 hours of sleep has bought them 11 hours of wakefulness. So in that particular individual who woke at 6 o'clock in the morning, we count forward 11 hours, which takes them till 5 o'clock in the afternoon. From that point onwards, their fatigue score will go up by 1 point for each hour of additional wakefulness while they're at work. That individual ran out of sleep by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At that point, their fatigue score went up by 1 point for each hour. So at 6, it went up by +1. By 7, it went up by +2, and by 8 o'clock, it went up by +3. So you can see that while the fatigue score at the start of the shift was a 6, by the end of the shift, it had reached +9. These two numbers provide you a metric that forms the basis of the conversation in undertaking the risk assessment. That is the conversation between the employer, manager, supervisor, or line manager. And what's important to understand is once that discussion is based around a number, it becomes a much less emotional discussion. That is, it's not, I feel tired, to which the response would typically be, toughen up, princess, but it is, my fatigue score is a 6 or a 9 or a 7 or a 5. Let's try the next example. If we look at example 2, we have a situation in which an individual is working a night shift, that is from 6 p.m. at night until 6 a.m. the following morning. If you look at the graphic as it's on the screen in front of you, you will see that that individual slept for 6 hours between 10 a.m. and 1600 or 4 p.m. in the afternoon for a total of 6 hours, and for the day before they also slept between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. or 1600 hours. If we go through the calculation again and we look at the start of the shift, which started at 8 p.m, we count up the amount of sleep that that individual had in the 24 hours prior to starting sleep. In this case, the individual had 6, which is above the threshold, so there are no points. Similarly, if we count back to the amount of sleep the individual had in the 48 hours prior to starting work, you'll see that that individual has had 12 hours of sleep. That is the threshold value. So again, there are no increase in fatigue points associated with the X or the Y values. If we look at the Z score at the start of the shift, how long has that individual been awake? Have they bought themselves enough wakefulness? You will see that that individual got up at 1600 hours to commence work at 1800 hours. They'd had 12 hours sleep, so they were well within their 12-hour window. So again, you'll see at the start of the shift, that individual had no fatigue points, no X, no Y, and no Z points. If we look at the end of the shift, again, the X and Y values are both 0, but in this case, the Z score has an extended period of wakefulness from 1600 through till 0600 the next day. That is a period of approximately 14 hours. So if we look at that and say the individual has been awake at the end of the shift for 14 hours, but they only had 12 hours of sleep in the prior 48, that means for the last 2 hours of the shift, they were clocking up additional fatigue points. So by 5 o'clock it had gone +1, and by 6 o'clock in the morning it had gone +2. So for this example, the individual commences the shift with a fatigue score of 0 and ends the shift with a fatigue score of +2. In contrast to the previous example, where we saw, in a sense, the relationship between sleep prior to night shift, and in particular where that sleep occurs in the afternoon almost immediately prior to starting work, example 3 looks at the traditional first night of night shift model. In this case, the individual started work again at 1800 hours and worked through a 12-hour shift finishing at 6 o'clock the next morning. But in this case, they had slept the previous night between 1 and 7 o'clock in the morning, and for the night before that between 0 and 0600. Again, a total of 6 hours in the prior 24 and 12 hours in the prior 48. Again, if we look at the calculation at the start of the shift, that individual has had 6 hours in the prior 24. 6 is above the threshold value 5, so there are no additional points for sleep in the prior 24 hours. The Y value, that is sleep in the prior 48 hours, has gone up to 12, and therefore 12 is at the threshold, so there are no additional points associated with the Y value. If we look at the Z value at the start of the shift, that individual awoke at 7 o'clock in the morning and had had 12 hours of sleep, so had bought themselves 12 hours of wakefulness, which took them from 0700 in the morning through till 1900 that night. So at the start of the shift, that individual's score was still 0. However, as is often the case on the first night of night shift, this individual by the end of the night shift had been up for around 24 hours and had not had sufficient sleep in order to buy that much wakefulness. So if we look at the end of shift calculation, again we will see 0 for the X and the Y values, but in this case the individual had been awake for 23 hours at the end of the shift, but they had only had 12 hours sleep. So by the end of the shift, they had been awake for 11 hours more than the amount of sleep that they had bought themselves. So in this case, at the start of the shift, the individual's fatigue score is 0, and at the end of the shift, their fatigue score was +11. Okay, so what do these numbers actually mean? What does a 2 mean? What does a 6 mean? What does a 10, 15, or 20 mean? Part of the challenge with these kinds of approaches is that there needs to be a mechanism for calibrating what those values mean. This slide gives you a calibration scale associated with the fatigue likelihood scores that you've just been calculating. You will see from the scale that we've put a green value down at 0, a yellow value between 0 and 6, a red value between 6 and nearly 10, and then it goes black from 12 and above. These calibration values are admittedly arbitrary in terms of the colour coding, but reflect benchmarking against current industry standards. But let's take you through the scale first before we explain a little bit more about where the benchmarking values come from. You will see at the bottom of the scale a fatigue likelihood score of 0 means that you're able to perform tasks safely and there are few external signs of fatigue. That means you've had at least 5 hours in the prior 24, at least 12 in the prior 48, and you haven't been awake for more than the amount of sleep that you've had in the prior 48 hours. It doesn't mean that you're bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It doesn't mean that your love life will be perfect. What it does mean, however, is that you're probably able to perform the kind of tasks that most people do in workplaces safely. However, as that fatigue likelihood score goes up, from 2 to 4 to 6 to 8, you will see that the behavioural anchors associated with that show a spectrum increase in the effects of fatigue. So you will see at a fatigue score of 2 that there will be slowed cognitions, occasional minor fatigue behaviours, and there may be minor changes that are observable in the individual's on-the-job performance. By the time you get up to a fatigue score of 12, and you'll see there it says struggling to stay focused on a task, difficulty concentrating, micro-sleeps are likely. Most people would say, yep, that's probably not the point at which I want you to be continuing to work. And again, if you think about the examples that we've done already, a fatigue score of 12 equates to somebody at the end of a 12-hour night shift on the first night of night shift. That is, having got up reasonably early in the morning, stayed awake all day, gone to work, finished work, and is now going home in the early hours of the morning, having been awake for 24 hours. And anybody who has worked a night shift, particularly on the first night, will realise that that description, i.e. struggling to stay focused on the task, difficulty concentrating, micro-sleeps likely, is a pretty reasonable experience or a pretty reasonable explanation of how one feels at the end of the first night of night shift. In between those values of 0 and 12, you'll see the behavioural anchors associated with that. And the question is how reliable and valid is this scale as an indicator? In our experience, the values on the scale between 0 and 14 are probably accurate to plus or minus 2 points. That is, if somebody's a 4, they'll probably rank themselves somewhere between the 2, 4 and 6 scales if we ask them in the workplace. And conversely, if somebody describes themselves with one of the behavioural anchors, i.e. difficulty concentrating, occasional lapses of attention, poor judgment on complex tasks, that individual will typically be somewhere between plus or minus 2. That is, they'll probably be reporting a score between 4 and 8. The measure isn't perfect, but the measure has about the same predictive relationship as you would find between blood alcohol concentration and performance. That is, it's good, but it's not perfect. For those of you who are interested and remember the slide from the previous section of the talk, if we were to look at the blood alcohol equivalency at the 0.05 to 0.1 range, you may remember by the first night of night shift that an individual would have a blood alcohol concentration equivalency typically between 4, 5, 6 o'clock in the morning. That means if you look at this scale, that a fatigue likelihood scale score of around about 12 probably corresponds to the legal limit for alcohol intoxication. Now, does it correspond exactly? Probably not. Are there individual variabilities? Of course. But the key point to understand is that by giving people a number, that number forms part of the subsequent organisational narrative. And as my father once said, unless you count it, it doesn't count. And one of the advantages of this particular approach to quantifying the risk associated with fatigue is that it relies on a process that is clear and objective. It enables an individual to calculate a score, and based on the amount of sleep and wake that they've had, the score will always be the same, assuming that they get the calculation correct. It's also very important to think about this in terms of how the organisational narrative responds to the way that people have a discussion about how fatigued they are. I'd like you to think about the following 2 ways that an individual could report fatigue at a workplace level. The first person comes in and says, I feel tired. And a supervisor is required to respond to that. On the other hand, if somebody comes in and says, I haven't had sufficient sleep in order to work safely, and my fatigue likelihood score is 11 or 10 or 9, the nature of that conversation is fundamentally different. When somebody comes in and says, I haven't had sufficient sleep in order to work safely, alarm bells start ringing in a supervisor's head. It also means that when the conversation is held in a structured way like this, that people are much less likely to engage in what we politely refer to as hairy-chested opportunities for management. So again, one of the beauties of this approach is that it provides clear thresholds that enable people to report when they have had insufficient sleep. And in the event that they have had insufficient sleep, it enables them to calculate a simple metric that enables the organisation to respond in a manner proportional to the level of risk associated with the lack of sleep. In this part of the course, we'd like to show you how to use that personal fatigue likelihood score in order to manage risk within the organisation. That is, once I know how fatigued I am, and that information is communicated to my line manager and the organisation, how will that information be used to structure the appropriate use of controls within the workplace? If you look on the slide, you'll see that we have a hazard control matrix, and you will see on the left-hand column that we have taken the fatigue likelihood scores and placed them into a number of coloured bands. The first band is green. The second band for scores between 1 and 6 is yellow. The third band, the red one, is for scores between 7 and 12. And then finally we have the black band, which is in scores for above 12. Now, where we set those values for the bands is relatively arbitrary and reflects a number of factors, including the risk appetite of the organisation. But if you're looking for benchmark values on this, it is rarely the case that organisations have started the black band above 15, and in some organisations we may see the black band start as low as 7. And typically, the yellow and the red bands are typically half of the range between 0 and that black band. Now, the way that the fatigue likelihood score is used is that it is the basis of a structured conversation between the line manager and that individual about how the risk will be managed. The important point to understand is that the hazard controls that are in place are pre-agreed. That is, the organisation has looked at the risks and determined what will be the appropriate controls to be put in place in the event that an individual reports within those bands. You may also remember that on the first night of night shift, an individual could have a score as high as 10, 11 or even 12. And for many workplaces, we accept that as a reasonable level of risk. So it's the important point to understand here is that we understand that fatigue is ubiquitous in workplaces. We also understand that it doesn't mean you don't work. What it means is that we identify the level of risk and that we manage that control appropriately. So if you look at those yellow, red and black bands on the screens, you will see a number of pre-agreed controls. Now, these controls are taken from an example organisation, and as I said before, both the levels or the scores associated with bands and the controls will be organisation specific. Most fatigue risk management systems will require you to have this matrix, but where you set the yellow, red and black bands and what the appropriate controls are will vary, not just by organisation, but maybe even by work group. Going back to what we talked about earlier, the person operating the photocopy machine may be looking at implementing very different controls to the person landing the jumbo jet. So let's go through each of these in some detail. If we look at the first row, this is for people whose fatigue score is 0. And you'll see that the hazard control is to do nothing unless there are other signs and symptoms of fatigue. So in this situation, where people have a fatigue score of 0, there's no hazard control or response required. If we go to the yellow band, you'll see that the text suggests that there is a minor increase in the likelihood of fatigue. And what you will see here are what we call self-management controls. Notify co-workers and supervisors and undertake a risk assessment for tasks with a risk consequence greater than 4. In effect, what we're saying here is that if you are doing something that's an extremely significant consequence of a fatigue-related error, you may want to look at managing it, but for most tasks it's not an issue. And you'll see here that the typical controls here are what we refer to as self-management controls. Typical controls would include self-monitoring, the use of caffeine, task rotation, increased levels of supervision, or self-paced workloads. In this situation, you'll find that the controls are typically managed with minimal impact on the individual's work performance. If we look at the red band, you'll see here that there is a moderate increase in the likelihood of fatigue. And you'll see again here, notify co-workers and supervisors and undertake a risk assessment for tasks with a risk consequence greater than 3. In this case, you will see what we call not self-management controls, but team management controls. So you would typically see situations with task reassignment, greater levels of supervision. And then finally, in the black band, you will see that there is a significant increase in the likelihood of fatigue. In this case, as you read the text, it is okay for individuals to undertake tasks which have a relatively insignificant consequence of fatigue-related error. In effect, this is where you send somebody to work in the warehouse or to operate the photocopy machine. But with all of these, you will see that there's a couple of important dimensions. The first is that all of them require notification. If you know what your fatigue score is, it's a very simple piece of information to communicate to your co-workers and supervisors. Just knowing the fact that the individual that you're working with is fatigued will change the way in which you operate. If you look at this approach of the green, yellow, red and black, there's a lot of ways that this can be used in organisations, from the very simple to the quite sophisticated. One of the best examples we've seen of implementing this was the early work done by Virgin Australia, where they had a very simple approach to this. In their organisational framework or culture, they had the green, yellow, red and black bands. In their case, the yellow band went from 1 to 4, the red band went from 5 to 7, and then the black band was 7+. And they had a very simple but catchy way of explaining this, which was, if it was in the yellow band, look out for yourself. If it was in the red band, look out for each other. And if in the black band, it was just look out. And that was a very simple way for people to encapsulate what the typical types of controls that would be implemented and used. How you actually do this as an organisation does actually require some conversations, some consultations with people, and some process of assigning and understanding what kind of controls would be appropriate for what kind of tasks in the organisation. But it is really important to understand that once you have a process of calculating the fatigue likelihood score and a structured set of responses, then the opportunities for improvisation become very small. One of the reasons this works is because it creates a language that signals that this is an organisationally anticipated issue. So by explaining to people how to calculate the fatigue likelihood score, by using that fatigue likelihood score to drive what the subsequent controls and performance issues will be, and in many cases making decisions about how to manage the business in response to that level of fatigue, actually provide a very structured approach to controlling the risk. This is, however, not without its problems. And in the next section, we'll talk about some of the problems, difficulties and challenges associated with the use of the prior sleep-wake rules. As we said before, the level 2 controls are a very effective technique for ensuring that employees discharge their duty of care obligations under occupational health and safety law. That is, as you will recall from the previous slides, the organisation's responsibility is to ensure that people are provided an adequate opportunity to rest and recover. And the level 2 controls were a mechanism whereby employees could determine whether they had used that opportunity to gain sufficient sleep. And in the event that they hadn't, they were in a position to notify our line manager so the organisation could respond appropriately and in a structured way to the risks potentially associated with that level of fatigue. What you will see from the use of the prior sleep-wake rules and the calculation of a fatigue likelihood score is a process whereby organisations can structure their approach to managing employee fatigue due to non-work related causes. But the cultural assumptions that the use of this kind of approach are built on can be quite significant. It does require an organisation to have a level of maturity in order to deal with the risk and to accept the fact that on some occasions individuals will be under the influence of fatigue and that is to a certain extent unavoidable. It does require that the organisation have a just culture framework for managing that risk. Our experience with these kinds of approaches suggests that how you implement level 2 controls requires a considerable level of thought by the organisation and a very realistic understanding of the level of maturity in your organisation. What I'd like to do is to talk about some of the experiences we've had with the implementation of level 2 controls and some of the things that you may need to think about as an organisation undertaking the implementation of level 2 controls. One of the other questions that often arises when one has to implement the personal fatigue likelihood scale within an organisation is where should I set those values on the left-hand column? That is, where does the black start, where does the yellow and the red start? As I said before, that's a relatively arbitrary decision and isn't necessarily one that should be overly conservative to start with. In most organisations, the introduction of level 2 controls is over and above what you're required to do legally. So anything that you introduce is actually over and above what your legal responsibilities are. So one of the important things to think about is when you introduce that, it's always better to introduce it at the less conservative end, and then you can tighten it over time as you develop comfort and control over that particular measure. So we would see, for example, in many organisations, they may introduce the black zone of the sleep-wake rules at maybe a score of 15, and over the next couple of years drop it down from 15 maybe to 12. It's important to understand the maturity of the organisation and the impact of what that control will have. If you introduce a control that is too tight, one of the difficulties you can have is the operational consequences for that are too severe for the organisation to adapt to quickly. On the other hand, if you introduce something conservatively and tighten it over time, then the organisation has the ability to adapt and control that process in a much more strategic manner. We have found, for example, when organisations introduce prior sleep-wake rules, then one of the things that is often the case is that management are extremely concerned that there's going to be a fatigue epidemic. Now, in practice, that rarely happens, but nevertheless, there is this fear that everybody will put up their hand. One of the key points about introducing these prior sleep-wake systems is that the use of the control needs to be seen as an indicator of the health or otherwise of the safety management system. So we would say, for example, that many organisations should introduce fatigue management controls around prior sleep-wake in a performance-based manner. In many cases, we suggest it should be done in the same way that is done for sick leave. That is, if somebody puts up their hand and indicates that their level of fatigue is such a level that it's inappropriate to work, and that happens too often, then it's time for a cold cup of tea and a conversation with the boss as to why that is actually happening. It's important to understand that the threshold values around the prior sleep-wake model have been set specifically so that they do two things. The first thing that you want it to do is to demonstrate to people that fatigue is a ubiquitous phenomenon in the organisation. By setting the values from 0 to 12 and getting people to notify co-workers at those yellow and red bands, you normalise the process. That is, it's okay to talk about it. Yep, I'm a little bit fatigued today, my score is 4 or 7, and here's what we do, and we manage that. Because that becomes a frequent conversation in the organisation, then it becomes normalised, and it's no big deal. And that's a really important point in terms of managing fatigue as a hazard. You've got to make it something that happens all the time and that we manage every day. One of the big difficulties in organisations is people put their hands up so frequently that when somebody does, everybody takes a deep breath and there's silence around the organisation. That actually makes it difficult for people to put up their hand and do it because they're aware of how the organisation will respond to them doing that. Similarly, if they do put their hand up and indicate that they are fatigued too often, then that suggests that there's a more fundamental underlying problem. If you look at the research literature on this, that is how often in an organisation, for completely normal, understandable reasons, does somebody enter in the black zone, then typically you would expect to see it happen 3 to 5 times a year. For most people, 3 to 5 events a year are where circumstances conspire against them and mean that they don't get sufficient sleep. In many organisations, we'll set a threshold that says if somebody's hand goes up more than 3 times in 90 days, then that triggers a de facto response to investigate why that individual has got a problem. However, it's really important to understand that where there is a discussion over the causes of fatigue, that when fatigue is identified by an individual, it's probably not appropriate that the root cause analysis be undertaken by the supervisor. Our experience is that supervisors often don't have sufficient skills and are often very reluctant to have conversations which they think impact often on the privacy or personal circumstances of an individual. So, as a general principle, the default setting that we would recommend to organisations, if somebody puts their hand up 3 times in 90 days, if they put their hand up again, then it should be the case that there is some process of analysis and understanding and trying to determine what the causes are. Our advice to most organisations is that should be done by somebody independent of the supervisor-worker relationship. So it could be an occupational health and safety specialist, it could be a nurse hygienist, it could be somebody from an employee assistance program. The key point to understand is that it should be somebody independent of the relationship between the supervisor and the manager. Sorry, between the supervisor and the worker. The second issue that becomes important in the implementation of these controls is how do you operationalise the discussion that people have around when they report that they're fatigued. And again, as we've referred to on a number of occasions before, this notion of dealing with the hairy-chested management experience is actually critical to making fatigue management an integral part of safety management. You need people to be able to report that they're fatigued, and you need people to be able to manage that process simply and effectively with the minimum opportunity for it to become emotional. One of the things that we have found has been particularly useful in organisations is to structure the language between the supervisor and the worker around how fatigue is reported. We do this for the same reason that the aviation industry engages in the same process around authority gradient challenges. So some of you may be familiar that in the aviation industry, if a co-pilot, that is a junior pilot to the command pilot, is actually concerned that the senior pilot is doing something that is potentially unsafe, the aviation industry has a set of control words that they use. In this particular situation, the junior pilot is required to say, "Captain, you must listen to me." And if those magic words or authority challenge words are used, then the organisational policy is that the captain doesn't remain quiet for the next 30 seconds and listen to the junior pilot, then it's effectively a dismissible response. By assigning magic status to those words, "Captain, you must listen to me," and that having a clear organisational consequence, it provides the capacity for an individual to challenge an authority gradient where it may get in the way of good safety. It's exactly the same in terms of fatigue management. That is, we would recommend a highly structured interaction where an employee reports fatigue to a supervisor, and we have found it particularly successful when employees come to a supervisor or line managers and say, "I have had insufficient sleep in order to work safely. My fatigue score is whatever it happens to be." In response to that, the supervisor needs to say, "Thank you for telling me. We will check your fatigue calculation score to make sure that you've got it right, and then we will go to the hazard control matrix and follow exactly the controls that are put there." What's really important is that the supervisor doesn't need to understand why you are fatigued in order to manage the hazard. And one of the problems that we find in organisations is that many people are afraid to talk about being fatigued because they are worried about the interrogation that will happen as to the whys and wherefores about how they managed to get fatigued. We actually find that supervisors find it a very liberating experience not to have to inquire. Although I will make the point that some of the worst supervisors are often those who are ostensibly the most caring and sharing. So often we will find people, for all of the right reasons, wanting to be a caring and sharing manager and wanting to say, why are you fatigued and what happened? It actually turns out to be the case that that's a relatively ineffective approach. The best thing that you can possibly do is to say, thank you for telling me. Is it likely to reoccur again in the near future? And if the answer to that is no, then you move straight to the control of the hazard. The only exception to that is where the individual would report it for more than 3 times in that 90-day period. And we would suggest in that situation that that should trigger an automatic root cause investigation, but again, not by the supervisor. It should be done by an appropriate professional outside of the worker-employee-employer relationship.